All right, here we go with Chapter 9, Language and Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder. So the learning outcomes are going to be to define autism and explain the major characteristics associated with autism, describe the language and literacy characteristics of children with autism spectrum disorders, and describe intervention approaches developed to help children with ASD increase their language and communication skills. Watch the video I've put up here, and in As You Learn, it's really good. To show some early on autism signs. Autism spectrum disorder is a complex developmental disability. It's characterized by significant problems with social interaction and communication. All right, so it's going to be right in what a speech language pathologist is going to need to work on, and also characterized by restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and or activities. According to the DSM-5, they actually eliminated several previous types of autism as separate disorders, including Asperger's syndrome, and combined them into one category with really 3 levels of severity. So you no longer have different types of autism, it's just by severity level. So those requiring very substantial support, so severe deficits in verbal and nonverbal social communication, those requiring substantial support, characterized by marked deficits in verbal and verbal social communication, and those requiring support, characterized by impairments in social communication when supports are not in place. Now, we've had a lot of people with autism aren't thrilled with that, but that's where we are from, at least from a DSM standpoint. The definition also requires that identification include whether or not the individual has an intellectual impairment, an accompanying language impairment, and or an associated medical or genetic condition. So you don't have to have those, right? But that has to be part of, if someone is categorized with autism, we also need to include where they are intellectually, language-wise, and medically. Young children with ASD often are not responsive to parents and other caregivers. They're often just kind of doing their own thing. They don't respond to the subtle social stimuli of facial expressions and body movements that form the foundation of human social interaction. They engage in joint attention with their parents and others much less than typically developing children, right? And we've talked about how important joint attention is. If you're not paying attention to what someone's talking about, you then lose all that language, right? If your mother's talking about the food you're eating, but you're watching the trees move in the wind out the window, all the words your mom is saying don't make any sense because you're looking at a tree out the window. So there's no language learning taking place, right? These early deficits don't go away and persist through the school years and into adulthood. I mean, that's, again, you've got some adults with autism who are on the mild side, right? Who require minimum support at best, would say, I have differences, not deficits. So again, there's still a lot of pushback with what the DSM-5 is doing here. Children with ASD also have impairments in language, especially in using language for communication. So it's really a communication disorder is one of the things at the heart of autism. And again, so that's going to involve language a lot. Some kids will never develop speech. Again, there's going to be a wide spectrum of what kids are doing, not doing, what adults are doing and not doing. According to the DSM-5, the restricted repertoire of activities and interests include stereotyped or repetitive motor movements in the way that objects are used, so lining up objects, or in speech, repeating of phrases spoken by others, repeating of words that they've said, repeating of phrases that they've said, insistence on sameness, routines, patterns of behaviors, so wearing the same clothes every day, becoming upset by any change in schedule. So there's also a big sensory, there's a motor difference and there's a sensory difference, right? Where often things can feel very extreme to people with autism. And we'll talk about this in a second too, but we can have bright lights might be hard. Certain fabrics might be hard. Change is going to be hard. So, that things being the same, things being routine, is going to be very important to people with autism. They'll often have highly restricted interests that are unusually intense or focused. So a preoccupation with particular objects, time periods, ideas. Again, some adults with autism will tell you that, that can be a really good thing, that they are focused on things, that, you've got some people with autism that are really into the work that they do and are really, really successful. So, is this a problem? Is this actually a superpower? It's going to depend on what it is, right? We're going to have, here it is, the hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. So you can have people with an indifference to pain or temperature, or any small touch or something like that could be terrible. You can have a fascination with movement of water, or it could be scary. Inconsistent responses to sound. So depending on the frequency and the loudness, it can be very upsetting versus not even, you wouldn't even know that they've heard it because there's no reaction going on. So again, that sensory issue plays a big role here. Many children with ASD engage in stereotypical behaviors, such as spinning objects, twirling their fingers in front of their face, slapping their heads, flapping their hands, as we go. And again, right, a lot of this is going to be sensory. Things are going to feel good versus feel stressful or feel uncomfortable. And they're going to might try to move their body in a certain way in order to feel comfortable and to feel less stressed or uncomfortable. These behaviors may increase or decrease in intensity based on the child's age and social situations. Now, kids with autism certainly aren't the only ones who do this. But most people with autism will do this. So others will also have these different kinds of behaviors, because again, it's a sensory issue. So you can have a sensory issue and not have autism, and do these things as well. Right? Causes of ASD, early theories of autism focused on the family and family interaction as the cause. It was suggested that an emotionally cold and rigid parenting style, refrigerator parents, caused autism, right? With the emergence of Freud in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we started to blame everything on the parents, really blaming everything on mom. Now we know a lot better. Autism has really nothing to do with parenting style, not a cause of autism. The big cause, and again, this is going to be really similar to other speech and language disorders, right? So it's really a genetic chromosomal disorder. So it's going to be the cause. We may or may not have isolated some specific chromosomes or genes with the disorder. I think we're going to find out a lot more soon. Some people will call it a central nervous system disorder, where many different areas of the brain, the frontal lobe, the amygdala, hippocampus, brainstem, have all been identified as being involved in autism in some way. People with autism can have a different neurochemical construction. Chemicals such as serotonin especially have been implicated in the disorder, but again, it's not with everybody, and that makes it confusing. One thing we know now is that, it was for a while, people were really considering vaccinations an issue. We've had, this issue has been studied over and over again now, and we're pretty close to positive that vaccinations have no cause in autism. People who have been vaccinated versus haven't, there's not a difference in incidence with autism. An increasing proportion of all cases have links to genetic variants. Right, so we could have, it's possible that, just like in Down syndrome, where they have a whole chromosome is copied, people are thinking that maybe parts of some genes are going to be copied and repeated, and that may be a cause. But again, we don't know. And it's also possible that what we call autism could be a group of disorders with various characteristics, right? So if you're somebody that has let's say a severe language disorder, you've got a sensory impairment, those things combined, maybe anxiety and ADHD on top of it. If you have those four things, add them together, and they're going to say that you have autism. So we may have some people too that are identified as autistic, but may or may not have that genetic difference involved. As we learn more about the neurobiological basis of autism, we may find that specific symptoms can be explained by biological factors, even if it's a puzzle still in a lot of ways, again, just like all of our disorders are. Many children with autism aren't identified until age 2, making it difficult for researchers to examine very early language development. However, they're doing really cool things. Because we know there's a big genetic link. If we have a child in the family who has autism, and there is a new baby on the way, researchers can really start videotaping and evaluating that new baby from 1 month, 2 months of age to follow them. And so we're able to identify things early, but we've also learned a lot more about what is it that kids that eventually have autism do early on versus kids who don't eventually have autism. So we're going to use home videos and kids that were followed from the very, very beginning. And one of the big things, young children with autism often have significant deficits in joint attention. That's going to be one of the biggies. They're less likely than their typically developing peers to share their attention with a caregiver over an object or activity. And again, that's going to create a big loss of language time. They're going to initiate and respond to joint interactions a lot less frequently, even when compared to other children with either developmental and or intellectual disabilities. And that, that really doesn't change a lot over time. We can teach that. And in some kids, they can do a lot better with that, but not in all kids. These kids are going to use fewer vocalizations, fewer nonverbal gestures than kids with language disorders and typically developing children. Right? They're just, again, kids with autism will just kind of do their own thing. And they kind of expect you to do your own thing. They're going to develop spoken language at a later age and develop it more slowly. There's an increasing evidence that these kids actually regress in language development during the early childhood years. Certainly not all people with autism, but there may be a subgroup. In fact, there probably is a subgroup of kids with autism who will be close to typical early on, and then their language skills will go farther away from average. And again, not all individuals with autism. In fact, it can be hard to find two people with autism who have the same language difficulties, the same level of severity across, form, content, and pragmatics. The language difficulties of children with autism can range from mild to severe. Again, more kids are going to be mild, fewer kids are going to be severe. Although it's been estimated that up to 25% of children with autism are non-speaking, that means that 75% or more are going to be verbal. Development in phonology. The development of phonological rules follows the same course found in typical developing children, but with delays, right? So a lot of times when they have speech, when the speech comes, it's going to be pretty intelligible and might be more advanced than that of their typically developing peers. So they're going to wait. A lot of these kids will wait to talk until they can talk in sentences and until they can talk, pretty intelligibly, whereas, your typical kids just starts at the one-word level and isn't very intelligible, and then that increases over time. These kids it's not uncommon for them to wait until, okay, I'm ready to talk now, and they just start talking. They might have considerable trouble with suprasegmental features such as stress and intonation. And it goes all over the board, right? You can have kids who speak in a sing-song pattern where they have a lot of fluctuations in vocal intensity, way too loud, way too soft, using intonations that just aren't appropriate to the meaning, right? So they might have a rising intonation, which we usually use for questions, but they use that for statements. And then the other extreme, you can have kids that are very monotone and don't have expression in their voices. So it really goes all over the map. There are some similarities and differences between the acquisition of morphological rules by kids with ASD and their peers. Syntax is going to be significantly delayed, but it follows a pretty normal pattern. Again, some kids are going to wait to talk until they have sentences. Other kids won't. There's going to be a great deal of variability in this population, and some children may deviate from this pattern of delayed development. Right? So some kids are going to be at the one-word level for a long time. Some kids will be at the sentence level immediately. It just depends. Pronoun reversal is going to be really common. They might say you when referring to themselves or me when referring to another person, right? So if I'm talking to a child with autism, I'm going to, refer to him or her as you, right? So I want you to do this. How are you doing? So they're going to go, oh, I guess I'm you. So when they talk about themselves, they're going to say you. And when they talk about me, they're going to say me, because that's how I refer to myself, right? So one possible part of that is going to be echolalia, which we're going to talk about in a second. And then the other idea is going to be cognitive development, right? That kind of what I was just talking about, that pronouns can change their referent in relation to the context. So depending on who's speaking, right, it changes who is me and who is I and who is you and who is he and her. So it's pretty complicated as we go along, right? There's going to be a lack of attention. So these kids may fail to attend to pronoun uses of others, might be a part two. Individuals with ASD, I thought we were going to talk about echolalia, and I'm sure it's there, but let's talk about it now because it was here, right? So echolalia is going to just be repeating back what somebody said. So you're just echoing them back. So, how are you? How are you? Well, I'm doing well. I'm doing well. What's your name? What's your name? All right. So rather than answering the question or, having a conversation, echolalia is just repeating back what you've said. All right. Individuals with ASD are going to have a mixed pattern of strengths and weaknesses in semantics. They may use more idiosyncratic language and neologism. So, idiosyncratic language, the use of conventional words or phrases in unusual ways to convey specific meanings. So, example that your book used was, it makes me want to go as deep as economical with it, which was interpreted to mean withdraw as much as possible. So they just kind of are making up their own language. So using conventional words in unusual ways. A neologism is a non-standard or invented word. So bloozers for bruises, or bells for rings, right? Because a ring kind of looks like a bell. So people with autism might call rings a bell, even though that's not the usual word. Individuals with ASD may have difficulty in using words correctly, using semantic concepts in natural situations. So they might be able to read words and understand those words, but then using them in a conversation is going to be really hard. Children with impairments in syntax might have more difficulty than with semantic tasks. So there might be a link between, right, if you have a hard time producing longer sentences and understanding longer sentences, you may also have these kids might also have difficulty with vocabulary at the same time. All right, pragmatics. Children with ASD have significant impairment in pragmatics. Right, it's a social area of language that is one of the hallmarks of autism. Researchers have found deficiencies in all aspects of pragmatic language, including speech acts, being able to listen, using polite terms in conversation, making irrelevant statements, staying on topic, inappropriate comments. They rarely initiate communication spontaneously and produce fewer communicative acts than do mental age-matched children with language delays or typically developing children, right? So they're just kind of doing their own thing. They're not going to initiate with others. The language and communication difficulties associated with Asperger's, right? So higher functioning, autism, or kids that don't need as much support, failure to adjust their language production in response to the context. So you might have people who are very formal and use very formal language and speech with their friends and with children in a way that an average person might only use with, a teacher or a boss or something. They could have a tendency to initiate conversation without regard to the listener's interest in the topic, right? So if this person's really interested in Star Wars or trains, they're just going to start talking about Star Wars, whether or not their conversational partner cares, or whether that was even a topic that they had been talking about. Use of socially inappropriate topics, asking someone about their weight, asking someone why they're so ugly, difficulty understanding non-literal language, right? So they're going to be very concrete, shifting conversational topics abruptly. Again, if I'm not that interested in what you're talking about, I'm going to talk about Star Wars, right? Because that's what I care about. These difficulties often have a negative impact on the ability of individuals with high-functioning autism to develop social relationships and to be accepted in the community. Some people with autism are going to be upset by this and really want friends and want to have more people around them, and others are going to be perfectly fine to kind of live on their own and have their own things going. All right, so here's echolalia. So it's the literal repetition of speech produced by others. You can have immediate echolalia, where you're, saying it immediately after. Again, how are you? How are you? I'm good. I'm good. What's your name? What's your name? So, Gloria, what did you do last night? And the student responds, what did you do last night? You can also have delayed echolalia, where the repetitions of words or phrases that may have been heard days, weeks, or even years ago. While working quietly at a desk, the child suddenly shouts, what's the matter with you? You can't do that. Mitigated echolalia, the structure of the original utterance is changed when repeated. So the teacher says, what did you do last night? And the student responds, night. Okay. Echolalia is found among other individuals with disabilities, but it persists far longer and occurs more frequently in children with autism. So it's going to be, again, one of the hallmarks of autism. All right, we are going to stop here with part 1.